The story of the Middle Ages is often told through kings, knights, and castles gleaming in the sunlight. But far beneath the surface, another story unfolded in the dark. It was the story of the miners, men, women, and children, who clawed at the earth with picks and hammers, whose sweat and blood supplied the very foundations of medieval civilization. Their lives were brutal, their labor hidden. Yet without them, the gold that adorned crowns, the iron that forged swords, and the salt that preserved food would never have reached the tables of lords or the coffers of kings. To walk into a medieval mine was to enter a world that few ever saw and fewer still survived. These were not the vast mechanized operations of later centuries, but crude and perilous holes in the ground, pits and shafts cut into the rock with primitive tools. Miners descended into the earth with little more than a flickering torch for light, the air damp and suffocating, the walls pressing close around them. Each strike of the pick was a gamble. Each day's labor could end in wealth, or in a collapse that buried them alive. The paradox of mining was cruel. The noble and wealthy flaunted the products of miners' toil, jewels set in golden chalices, silver coins stamped with royal seals, iron weapons carried by armies, yet the miners themselves lived in poverty, their bodies broken by labor, their lives often cut short. A coin might glitter in the hand of a noble, but behind it lay the cough of a miner choking on dust, the hunched back of a child carrying a basket of ore, the widow mourning at the mouth of a shaft. For the peasant farmer, the harvest was uncertain, but at least tied to the rhythms of the seasons. For the miner, there was no such cycle, no respite. The earth gave grudgingly, and to extract its riches meant constant danger. Floodwaters might seep into tunnels, drowning men where they stood. Fumes could build up, choking the air. A sudden collapse of rock could crush a dozen lives in an instant. In the darkness below, fear was ever present, and survival was never guaranteed. And yet, despite the danger, mining was inescapable. Lords demanded it, kings depended on it, and towns thrived upon it. Villages sprang up around mines, entire communities bound to the earth like serfs to the plow. Fathers passed down their grim trade to sons, wives joined them in carrying burdens, and children followed, their small bodies better suited for the narrowest, most suffocating spaces. Mining was not just an occupation, it was a sentence, inherited as much as land or title. For medieval society, miners were both vital and invisible. Their existence was acknowledged only when wealth flowed from their labor, or when disaster struck and a mine collapsed, leaving families destitute. Chronicles speak little of them, for chroniclers sat in monasteries, not mines. Yet without these forgotten workers, the wealth of nations would have been dust. They were the invisible hands that shaped the visible world. To descend into the mines was to trade daylight for darkness, fresh air for dust, safety for constant peril. And once you entered, there was no guarantee you would return. But miners did so, day after day, driven by obligation, necessity, and the faint hope of wages that might keep hunger from their doors. They lived harsh lives, unseen, uncelebrated, but in truth, they carried the weight of kingdoms on their bent and weary shoulders. This is their story, not of glittering treasures in royal vaults, but of the men and women beneath the earth, battling stone, darkness, and death to feed a world that barely remembered their names. The medieval miner's world was defined by what he wrestled from the earth. Unlike the farmer, who reaped crops from soil, the miner harvested stone, ore, and minerals that shaped kingdoms and fueled survival. What he carried up from the darkness was not simply raw material, it was the lifeblood of the Middle Ages. Every glint of silver in a coin, every slab of iron hammered into a sword, every pinch of salt that kept meat from rotting traced its origin back to a miner's hands. Precious metals were the most coveted. Silver was perhaps the greatest prize, for it formed the backbone of medieval currency. Mines in Saxony, Bohemia, and the Harz Mountains turned out tons of it, their wealth filling the treasuries of kings and fueling trade across Europe. Gold, though rarer, gleamed from mines in Hungary and Transylvania, its brilliance gracing chalices, crowns, and reliquaries. But both silver and gold were deceptive blessings. For every shining coin minted, countless miners had gasped in dark tunnels, breaking stone with hammers until their arms trembled, hoping to strike a vein before the mountain struck them down. Iron was less glamorous, but far more essential. It was the skeleton of the medieval world, forged into plowshares, nails, hinges, and, of course, the weapons of war. Iron mines in England, France, and Central Europe supplied the raw material that armed knights and fortified castles. Yet extracting it was backbreaking work. Unlike precious metals, iron ore was heavy and plentiful, but it demanded endless hauling and smelting before it became usable. For miners, it meant long hours of hacking and dragging stone from deep shafts, the reward small compared to the labor invested. Lead and copper also had their place. Lead, soft and malleable, lined roofs and pipes, and filled the gutters of great cathedrals. Copper, gleaming with reddish fire, was prized for coinage, jewelry, and bronze alloys. These were often found alongside silver, and miners learned to separate them by crude smelting techniques. But lead, though useful, carried a hidden poison. Miners exposed to its dust often grew sick, their joints aching, their breath short, their lives shortened without ever knowing why. Perhaps the most overlooked treasures of the medieval earth were not metals, but salt and coal. Salt was not a luxury, but a necessity. Without it, meat spoiled, fish rotted, and survival through winter became impossible. Great salt mines at Salzburg and Wieliczka in Poland became as valuable as gold, their tunnels stretching into the depths like cathedrals of crystal. To work in them was suffocating and perilous, but their product preserved life itself, making salt one of the most fiercely contested resources of the Middle Ages. Coal, meanwhile, was the fuel of the future. In the early Middle Ages, it was used sparingly, for wood was the common source of fire. But as forests dwindled and towns grew, coal became increasingly vital. Miners in England dug shallow pits to reach seams of sea coal, a foul-smelling fuel that nevertheless burned hotter and longer than wood. Though despised for its smoke, it quietly heralded the coming shift toward an industrial world centuries later. Each mineral or metal extracted from the earth held its own story of necessity, wealth, and suffering. For lords and kings, these resources were symbols of power and prosperity. For miners, they were burdens, heavy stones dragged from darkness, sweat mingled with dust, lives cut short in pursuit of riches they themselves would never hold. The glitter of the medieval world shone all the brighter because it was purchased with shadows. And so, while nobles toasted with golden goblets and armies clashed with iron blades, the miners below knew a different truth, that the earth's bounty was always paid for with flesh, blood, and bone. To step into a medieval mine was to abandon the light of day. Unlike the sprawling quarries of later centuries, these mines were narrow, claustrophobic, and crude. At first, miners dug shallow pits in riverbeds and hillsides, scratching at exposed veins of ore with little more than wooden shovels and stone hammers. But as the surface bounty dwindled, they were forced to burrow deeper, sinking shafts into the earth that became black labyrinths where danger lurked in every shadow. The shafts were often no wider than a man's shoulders. Timber supports creaked under the weight of the earth, and dripping water echoed like distant whispers in the dark. Miners carried torches or oil lamps, but the flames ate away at the already thin air, leaving them lightheaded, their lungs burning as if the mountain itself resisted their intrusion. To descend into these tunnels was to crawl into a grave, and every miner knew it. Yet down they went, again and again, because the kingdom demanded its silver, its iron, its salt. Tools were primitive, but brutal in their efficiency. Iron picks and hammers chipped at stone inch by inch, while wooden wedges, soaked in water, were driven into cracks to split rock apart. Baskets of ore were hauled to the surface by hand, or lifted with simple windlasses, wooden cranks turned by weary arms or the backs of donkeys. Ropes frayed, buckets slipped, and men were crushed under the very loads they carried. Every tool was a reminder of both ingenuity and limitation, for the miners fought not only the earth but the absence of technology to tame it. Ventilation was a constant problem. With every foot dug deeper, fresh air grew scarcer, and miners sometimes lay on their bellies, gasping for breath, before crawling back to the surface. Some shafts had rudimentary air shafts carved upward, while others relied on bellows pumping air through crude pipes. Fires were lit at tunnel entrances to draw in drafts, but the smoke they created often poisoned more than it helped. In many cases, miners simply endured the choking air, their lungs filling with dust until coughing became as natural as breathing. Flooding was another constant enemy. In wet mines, water seeped from walls and pooled in shafts, drowning tools, extinguishing torches, and threatening to swallow men whole. Buckets and leather bags were hauled up endlessly to keep tunnels dry, a Sisyphean task that wore out bodies as quickly as the picks that split the rock. It was not until later centuries that water wheels were adapted to pump out mines, but in the early and high Middle Ages, the miners' only defense was muscle and desperation. Even light itself betrayed them. Torches sputtered and died in pockets of foul air, leaving men blind in an instant. Worse still, some gases ignited when touched by flame, creating deadly explosions in the confined tunnels. The miners, unable to understand the science of their peril, whispered of angry spirits in the earth, punishing them for their intrusion. And in truth, the mine felt alive, its groans and collapses like the voice of something ancient and wrathful. The sheer physical strain was staggering. Miners worked bent double in low galleries, their backs twisted, their muscles trembling as they struck stone hour after hour. They emerged at dusk covered in grime, their hands blistered and raw, their lungs coated in dust. Many would return the next morning, driven not by choice but by obligation, for lords and kings demanded ore as surely as the earth resisted giving it. To enter the medieval mine was to enter a battlefield where the enemy was stone, water, and air itself. Every tool was a weapon wielded against nature's resistance. And though miners were armed with little more than crude picks and flickering torches, they fought tirelessly, carving out wealth for a world above that scarcely knew their names. The life of a medieval miner was measured not in years, but in the toll taken on his body. Even before death claimed him in a collapse or flood, the mine carved itself into his bones, his lungs, and his skin. To look upon a miner was to see a man prematurely aged, stooped and scarred, his strength spent far too soon. If the earth did not bury him outright, it slowly devoured him. One breath, one blow of the hammer, one ragged cough at a time. Every movement underground was a strain. Crawling through shafts barely wide enough to pass, miners contorted their bodies until joints ached and spines bent. Hours of swinging picks in confined spaces wore away muscle and sinew, leaving hands blistered and hardened into claws. The dust clung to every pore, grinding into eyes and filling lungs until vision blurred and breath rattled like dry leaves in the wind. Coughing was constant, a companion as familiar as the clink of iron on stone. Accidents were merciless. A loosened rock could tumble from above, striking a man dead before he even cried out. Shafts collapsed without warning, entombing groups of miners in an instant. In places where water seeped into tunnels, floods struck with sudden violence, drowning men who moments before had been laboring in silence. Burns were no less common, as torches and oil lamps spilled fire in cramped galleries, igniting clothes or searing flesh. For the miner, every day was a wager against the mountain, and many lost. Injuries were seldom treated properly. Medical care in medieval villages was scarce, and few physicians ventured into mining towns. Broken bones might be bound with rough splints, wounds cauterized by searing iron, and sicknesses endured until death claimed them. A crushed limb or a gashed head often meant not just pain but the end of a man's livelihood. Without his labor, his family starved. The mine did not forgive weakness, and so many worked even with wounds unhealed, pressing on until exhaustion conquered them. The miner's diet was little better than the farmer's, but his labor was harsher. Bread, porridge, thin ale, and occasional scraps of meat gave scant nourishment for men burning through their strength in darkness. Dehydration haunted them, for hauling water to drink was secondary to hauling water from the mines. Salt was precious, and food spoiled quickly, leaving many to gnaw hard crusts that scraped their throats raw. Malnutrition left their bodies frail, their immune systems weak, their children stunted before they had a chance to grow. The miner's skin bore witness to his trade. Calloused hands cracked and bled, fingernails split from prying at stone, backs hunched from ceaseless strain. Dust turned hair gray before its time, and faces wore the mask of soot and grime. In the villages above, miners were known by their appearance as surely as by their craft. Thin, stooped men with hollow eyes, women with bent shoulders from carrying ore, children coughing as if old before their years. Exhaustion was the miner's constant companion. Work began at dawn and ended long after dusk, torches marking the hours where sun could not reach. Sleep was snatched on rough straw, bodies sore and unhealed, before returning underground again. The rhythm of their lives was brutal repetition, and hope was scarce. They were not laboring for wealth they would never see, but for survival, for wages that might keep hunger from gnawing at their families for one more season. In the end, the miner's body was a ledger of suffering. Each scar, each cough, each stoop of the back was an entry, written by the earth itself. And though they rarely lived long, their sacrifice endured in the world above, in every coin that changed hands, every weapon that clashed in battle, every stone that built a cathedral. Their bodies broke, but through their breaking, kingdoms thrived. The medieval mine was not only a place of toil, but a crucible of wealth. And with wealth came exploitation. For every ounce of silver or iron that miners hauled from the earth, a noble's purse grew heavier. Kings, bishops, and lords sat in the glow of candlelit halls, surrounded by coin and plate, while the miners whose sweat produced such treasure went home to mud-walled cottages, their hands empty, their bellies often unfilled. The mine was the perfect emblem of the medieval economy. Riches rising upward, suffering sinking downward. Ownership of mines was jealously guarded. In most regions, The right to mine belonged not to the men who wielded the picks, but to the crown or the local lord. Monarchs such as the Holy Roman Emperors claimed regalian rights, declaring all silver and gold beneath the earth theirs by divine authority. Lords leased out access to merchants, who in turn hired miners, setting wages barely enough to survive. The hierarchy was stark. Kings and nobles enriched, merchants profited, and miners remained bound to the rock like oxen to the plow. Payment for miners varied, but it was rarely generous. Some were serfs, compelled by feudal duty to dig ore for their lord without real compensation. Others worked for small daily wages or shares of ore, but these were often swallowed by debts to the very merchants who supplied their tools and food. Miners might spend months in darkness, only to emerge with barely enough coin to pay their rent or buy bread. Their labor was priceless, yet its reward was meager. Taxes and tithes pressed them further. Monarchs demanded a cut of every vein struck, while the church imposed tithes on the miners' scant earnings. Bishops themselves often held mining rights, financing cathedrals with silver drawn from the backs of laborers. The irony was sharp. The very faith miners clung to for protection was also an institution that profited from their misery. Yet piety bound them still, for to curse the system was to risk not just punishment, but damnation. Merchants who controlled smelting and trade gained fortunes. They bought ore cheaply, smelted it into pure metal, and sold it at many times its worth in distant markets. They became the new elite of mining towns, their houses rising in timber and stone, while miners lived in hovels nearby. Mining, like so much of the medieval economy, was a ladder, but one that miners themselves were forbidden to climb. Inequality bred resentment. In regions where miners were heavily exploited, strikes and uprisings sometimes erupted. Records from Germany and Bohemia tell of miners refusing to work, demanding fairer wages or lighter obligations. These were rare, for the risks of punishment were great, but they reveal that even in the darkness of the shafts, miners recognized their worth. Their labor powered kingdoms, and without it, wealth could not flow. But recognition did not translate into justice, and most uprisings were crushed before they won lasting change. At the same time, mining towns became economic centers despite the misery of those who fueled them. Villages around rich mines swelled into bustling settlements, their markets filled with traders, smiths, and innkeepers. Wealth drew opportunity, and some miners did rise if fortune and cunning favored them. A lucky discovery of a rich vein or a marriage into a merchant family might elevate a miner's descendants. But these were exceptions, stories told more as myth than as common truth. For most, the mine was a cycle of poverty passed down like a family heirloom. Thus, the economy of mining was built upon paradox. The work was indispensable yet despised, essential yet underpaid. It enriched the powerful while crippling those who did the labor. To peer into the glittering coffers of medieval Europe is to glimpse the shadow of miners, bent and weary, their suffering invisibly stamped upon every coin, every blade, every jewel. Wealth and exploitation walked hand in hand, and in that union, miners bore the heaviest burden. Mining was not the labor of men alone. Entire families were bound to the mine, drawn into its darkness or tethered to its endless demands. In mining villages, the line between work and home blurred until it vanished. Women, children, even the elderly played their parts in the brutal theater of extraction. The earth did not spare anyone. It demanded hands of all sizes, and so the miner's family became the miner's crew. Women worked tirelessly alongside men, though rarely acknowledged in records. They carried baskets of ore from shafts to surface, their backs bent under crushing loads. They washed and sorted stones in icy streams, fingers raw from the cold. They hauled water to quench thirst or to clear flooded tunnels, laboring until their arms ached. At times, women descended into the mines themselves, crawling through cramped galleries where their smaller frames were seen as an advantage. To some, they were the invisible backbone of the mining economy, their toil hidden in the shadow of men's picks. Children bore perhaps the harshest fate. From the moment they were strong enough to carry a basket or crawl through a tunnel, they became part of the labor force. Their small bodies made them ideal for the narrowest shafts, where grown men could not fit. They wriggled through spaces barely wider than their shoulders, scraping away ore with knives or small hammers. Many never saw daylight during the hours they worked, emerging pale and coughing, their childhood stolen by darkness. Those who survived grew into men and women marked by stunted growth and chronic illness, their bodies broken before they truly matured. Mining was a family ordeal because survival demanded it. A man's wages alone could not support his household, not when merchants and lords took their share. Women and children's labor supplemented the meager income, their efforts the difference between bread on the table or hunger at night. In villages around mines, every hand was put to use, and leisure was a luxury none could afford. Childhood was short, motherhood relentless, and old age a rarity. Yet despite the hardship, families carved out moments of endurance. Women tended small gardens near mining cottages, growing cabbages, onions, or herbs to stretch their diets. Children, though burdened with labor, sometimes turned play into survival, racing each other while carrying stones or singing songs to break the silence of tunnels. Families gathered in the evenings, sharing bread by candlelight, their laughter fragile but real. Even in lives defined by toil, they clung to the bonds of kinship, which gave them strength to face the mine again each dawn. Still, the risks were merciless. When disaster struck, a shaft collapse, a flood, or an outbreak of disease, it claimed not just individuals but entire families. A father lost to a cave-in meant a widow struggling to survive. A child suffocated in a shaft left scars that never healed. Mining villages were communities of shared grief, where bells tolled too often, and funerals became as common as weddings. Women wept together. Children grew up too fast, and every family knew it might be their turn next. Even so, families found pride in endurance. Miners and their kin bore their hardships with a stoicism forged by necessity. Some passed down stories of resilience, teaching children not only how to dig and carry, but how to endure suffering with dignity. In the songs of mining towns, women and children were not absent. They were the chorus, the unseen laborers who kept the rhythm of survival alive. The mine was not just a workplace, it was a way of life that consumed entire households. For women and children, the darkness was no less oppressive, the dangers no less real. They were, like their husbands and fathers, bound to the rock, their lives etched into its walls. And though history often forgets them, their sweat and tears were as much a part of the wealth of kingdoms as any vein of silver or nugget of gold. Deep underground, where the walls pressed in and the air grew thin, miners turned to faith as both shield and solace. To work in a medieval mine was to live daily in the shadow of death, and so the spiritual world became inseparable from the physical. Prayers echoed in the tunnels as often as the sound of picks, for miners believed that only divine protection could hold back the wrath of the earth. Saint Barbara was their greatest protector. Across Europe, miners invoked her name before descending into the shafts. She was the patron saint of those facing sudden death, and miners carried her image into the darkness, tucking small icons into their clothes or carving her likeness into wooden beams. Chapels dedicated to her sprang up near mining villages, and processions were held in her honor, seeking her intercession against cave-ins, floods, and fire. To go underground without her blessing was to tempt fate. But faith was not limited to saints alone. Miners often carved crosses into the entrance beams of tunnels, believing the holy sign would ward off evil spirits. They sprinkled holy water at the mouths of shafts and lit candles to guide souls lost to accidents. Before the first strike of the pick each day, some offered a silent prayer, a bargain between man and God. Grant me one more safe return, and I will labor faithfully again tomorrow. Superstition mingled with faith, born of fear and uncertainty. Many miners believed the earth itself was inhabited by spirits, sometimes protective, sometimes malevolent. German miners told tales of the Bergmännchen, small dwarf-like creatures who warned of danger with strange noises in the dark. To ignore their signs was to court disaster, but to treat them with respect might bring luck. In contrast, ominous groans or sudden collapses were often blamed on demons angered by man's intrusion into their domain. The fear of unseen forces was reinforced by the unpredictability of the mines. Poisonous gases killed without warning, shafts collapsed in silence, and explosions erupted when torches met foul air. With no understanding of geology or chemistry, miners turned to the language of the supernatural. They spoke of angry mountains, cursed veins of ore, or witches casting spells to seal off riches. These beliefs gave shape to dangers they could not explain, allowing them to endure the incomprehensible with stories that made sense of their peril. Faith was also communal. Mining towns often gathered in prayer before disasters or during long stretches of accidents. Priests blessed miners before dangerous descents, and bells rang out when deaths occurred, summoning the living to remember both the fragility of life and the need for penance. Entire communities leaned on religion not only for comfort, but for unity. Faith bound them together as tightly as timber beams held the shafts above their heads. Yet the reliance on faith could be both blessing and burden. While it gave miners hope, it also reinforced resignation. Suffering was often seen as God's will, disasters as divine punishment. This belief hardened them against despair, but also locked them in cycles of endurance without rebellion. They labored in the darkness not just because lords demanded it, but because they believed their toil and suffering were part of a larger plan, an earthly trial with eternal reward. In the end, faith was the one light miners could carry that never sputtered out. It was the whisper of St. Barbara's name before the descent, the flicker of a candle in a chapel dug into the hillside, the belief that even in darkness they were not abandoned. Fear haunted every strike of the pick, but faith steadied the hand that struck. Without it, the mines would have been unendurable. With it, miners found courage to face the abyss day after day. Though mining was practiced across medieval Europe, certain regions became renowned for their richness, their peril, and their influence on history. These were places where the earth gave up its treasures in abundance, yet demanded a terrible price in return. To speak of the Middle Ages without these mines is to miss the beating heart of its economy, for from their depths flowed the silver of kings, the salt of survival, and the iron of war. In the German lands, the Harz Mountains and Saxony were famous for their silver. By the 12th and 13th centuries, towns like Goslar thrived on the wealth of the Rammelsburg mine, where silver veins ran deep. Chroniclers described these mines as inexhaustible, though miners knew the truth. Each ounce of silver was pulled from the earth at great risk. Saxon silver filled imperial coffers, financing wars and cathedrals, and making the Holy Roman Empire a power to be reckoned with. Farther east, Bohemia's silver mines around Kutna Hora became legendary. In the 14th century, this town rivaled Prague itself in importance, its riches so vast that it was said, "He who holds Kutna Hora holds the crown of Bohemia." The mines there were labyrinthine, descending deep into the earth, worked by thousands of laborers whose sweat was minted into the Prague groschen, a coin that became standard currency across Central Europe. Yet even amid this wealth, miners lived harsh lives, their families surviving in poverty at the edge of the glittering prosperity their labor created. Hungary and Transylvania were famed for their gold. Mines in the Apuseni Mountains yielded treasures that adorned the crowns of kings and filled the treasuries of nobles. But extracting gold was particularly grueling, for veins were thin and demanded relentless digging. Floods and collapses were common, and miners worked in waterlogged tunnels, their tools slipping from numbed hands. Still, the lure of gold drew workers and merchants alike, for its brilliance bought power unlike any other metal. Not all mining was for precious metals. Salt was perhaps more valuable to daily life than gold or silver, and its extraction gave rise to great centers of wealth. The salt mines of Salzburg, carved into the Austrian Alps, were vast chambers where men hacked at glittering walls of rock salt. In Poland, the Wieliczka salt mine became legendary, its tunnels stretching for miles, so extensive that chapels were carved from salt itself. Salt preserved meat and fish, sustained armies, and made urban life possible. Without it, winter meant starvation, and so salt was rightly called white gold. Coal, too, began to emerge as a vital resource. In England, near the River Tyne and along coastal cliffs, miners dug out seams of sea coal, black and pungent, that washed up on beaches or was quarried from shallow pits. At first despised for its smoke, coal nonetheless became increasingly necessary as forests dwindled. By the late Middle Ages, it fueled forges and hearths, hinting at the Industrial Revolution's centuries yet to come. For the miners who scraped it from the earth, it was a filthy, choking labor, but it kept the fires of towns burning. These mining regions were not merely local economies, they shaped the destinies of nations. The silver of Saxony funded emperors, the salt of Krakow preserved armies, the gold of Hungary secured crowns, and the coal of England lit the path toward a new age. Wars were fought over these resources, treaties signed to secure them, and towns rose from obscurity to power because of them. Yet at the foundation of all this grandeur lay the miner, hunched in the dark, anonymous and forgotten. The legacy of these mines endures. Wieliczka still stands as a monument to centuries of labor, its salt chapels glowing like frozen cathedrals. Kutna Hora's medieval wealth is written in the stones of its grand churches, and across Europe the scars of exhausted mines mark the land, silent reminders of lives spent in darkness. They testify to both the brilliance and the brutality of the medieval age, when the wealth of kingdoms was hewn from the bones of the earth and the bodies of those who dug it out. The mines of the Middle Ages were crucibles not only of suffering, but also of invention. Hardship, necessity, and sheer desperation forced miners and engineers to push the limits of their knowledge, forging techniques that would lay the foundations for modern industry. For while the mine took countless lives, it also demanded ingenuity, and out of that relentless struggle came progress that reshaped Europe. One of the greatest challenges was water. Flooding plagued nearly every mine, seeping in from surrounding rock and filling shafts until work became impossible. At first, miners relied on buckets and leather bags, carried by hand or hoisted by simple pulleys, but as shafts sank deeper, these methods failed. By the 13th century, water wheels were harnessed underground, turning pumps that lifted water through wooden pipes. In regions like Saxony and Bohemia, vast systems of wheels and gears, powered by streams diverted from above, kept tunnels dry enough for men to work. It was backbreaking labor made slightly less impossible by ingenuity. Ventilation was another problem solved through painful trial and error. Torches devoured oxygen, and foul gases suffocated men in silence. To combat this, miners carved ventilation shafts to connect tunnels to the surface, creating drafts of fresh air. Fires lit at one end of a shaft sometimes drew air through the tunnels, crude but effective. Later, bellows were adapted to push air into deeper galleries. Though primitive, these systems represented early engineering efforts to tame an environment as hostile as the sea or sky. Ore extraction and transport, too, spurred innovation. Windlasses and treadwheels replaced bare-handed lifting, with men or donkeys walking in circles to haul baskets from depths too great for ropes alone. Wooden rails were laid in some tunnels to allow ore carts to be pushed more easily to the surface. These may seem modest steps, but they were the seeds of mechanization, the first stirrings of industrial machinery in Europe. Smelting also advanced under mining's pressure. The need to extract metal from ever poorer ores forced refinements in furnaces and the use of stronger bellows. Iron production improved with blast furnaces in the later Middle Ages, allowing higher temperatures and greater yields. Silver and copper smelting became more efficient, feeding the demands of mints and markets. Each improvement meant more wealth for lords and merchants, but for miners it meant more work, more ore to dig, and more time underground. Salt mines, too, inspired ingenuity. In Wieliczka, Poland, miners built entire subterranean systems with chapels, chambers, and ventilation shafts carved from salt itself. Brine was pumped to the surface, where it was boiled down in great pans to produce crystals of salt. These methods showed remarkable technical sophistication, rivaling any cathedral in complexity, though born of desperation to preserve food and sustain life. Even coal, despised for its smoke, forced adaptation. In England, shallow pits gave way to deeper shafts, requiring new methods of extraction and ventilation. Though still in its infancy, coal mining laid the groundwork for the energy systems of the modern world. Without realizing it, medieval miners were pioneering the first steps toward the industrial revolutions that would come centuries later. Innovation was not born from curiosity alone, but from survival. Each new pump, shaft, or smelting technique was an answer to a deadly problem. Without it, mines closed, families starved, and kingdoms weakened. With it, miners endured a little longer, and rulers grew a little richer. The cycle of hardship and invention intertwined, binding suffering to progress in a way that defined the medieval mining world. And so, though the miner himself often gained little from these advances, his suffering drove them. Every wheel, every pump, every improved furnace was forged in the crucible of necessity. The brilliance of medieval technology was not only in cathedrals or castles, but in the dark, hidden world below, where men fought the earth itself and forced it, however reluctantly, to yield its treasures. The story of the medieval miner does not end with the last basket of ore hauled to the surface or the final torch extinguished in the depths. Their legacy stretches far beyond the narrow shafts and suffocating tunnels where they labored. It is etched into the very fabric of Europe, in the coins that fueled trade, the iron that forged empires, the salt that preserved armies, and the coal that whispered of the world to come. Though nameless in chronicles and faceless in art, miners left behind a heritage as enduring as any king or knight. Their toil made possible the glittering wealth of courts, The crowns of monarchs, studded with jewels and framed in gold, were silent monuments to the men and women who clawed those riches from the earth. Cathedrals rose on foundations funded by silver mines, their spires reaching toward heaven even as miners beneath the ground prayed for a breath of fresh air. The prosperity of towns, the strength of armies, the splendor of relics, all bore the hidden mark of miners, whose suffering was transmuted into wealth for others. But the legacy of miners was not only wealth, it was also resilience. They endured lives of relentless hardship, carving out survival in a world that gave them little in return. Their bodies broke under the strain, their families wept at graves dug too often, yet still they labored, day after day. It is easy to marvel at the glittering treasures of medieval Europe, but behind each lies a testament to endurance. The miner's greatest gift to history was not gold or iron, but the proof of how far human beings can go to survive against overwhelming odds. Communities built around mines left their own imprints. Mining towns like Kutna Hora, Goslar, and Vilichka stand as monuments to an economy fueled by the earth's depths. These towns grew into centers of trade and culture, shaped by the rhythm of mining, and some still thrive today. Their architecture, laws, and traditions reflect centuries of struggle and adaptation, echoes of the men, women, and children who once gave their lives to the mines. On a broader scale, the miner's legacy was technological. Each pump, wheel, and ventilation shaft laid a foundation for the future. The innovations born of necessity in the medieval mines foreshadowed the great machines of the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. In the flicker of a miner's torch, one can glimpse the first sparks of modern industry, hidden in darkness yet destined to reshape the world. Their spiritual legacy is also profound. In their prayers to Saint Barbara, in their carved crosses and whispered superstitions, we see the human need for meaning in suffering. They lived in constant proximity to death, yet their faith gave them courage to return underground each day. This blend of faith and fear shaped not only mining culture, but the broader medieval worldview, a world where the sacred and the dangerous were inseparably intertwined. Yet perhaps the miner's greatest legacy is his invisibility. History remembers kings, warriors, and priests, but the miner remains largely anonymous, his name lost, his life unrecorded. And yet without him, the others could not have thrived. His invisibility is itself a lesson, that the true foundations of society are often laid by those who labor in silence, far from the gaze of chroniclers and artists. To remember the miner is to remember all those whose toil sustained the glory of others. In the end, the medieval miner's story is not one of triumph, but of endurance. They did not conquer the earth, they merely survived within it. But in surviving, they gave their world the metals that built swords and spires, coins and cathedrals. Their legacy is not written in gold leaf, but in scars, in tunnels that still echo with silence, in salt chapels that still stand, and in the unyielding truth that progress is always purchased at a price. They were the forgotten builders of the medieval world, and their story, once buried, still deserves to be told.